Welcome to the CBOQ learning session on congregational flourishing throughout and beyond the pandemic. My name is Paul Lamb, and I'm part of the Church Life and Leadership team at the CBOQ. My title is the Church Life and Leadership Associate. So at the CBOQ, I'm in charge of discipleship, spiritual formation, race conversations, soul days, spiritual formation retreats. And so I'm really interested in what Dr. Joel Thiessen is going to be talking about today. And I've actually, Dallas Friesen, who is my former supervisor and boss, miss him. He always talked about bringing Dr. Joel Thiessen to teach us, talk to us. So this is the privilege that all of us have today, is to learn and engage our minds and our hearts. Dr. Joel Thiessen is professor of sociology and director of Flourishing Congregation Institute at Ambrose University in Calgary, Alberta. He has authored and co-authored several books regarding Christianity, religious nuns, millennials, and congregation in Canada. For more information, go to www.joelthiessen.ca. I'll put that in the chat. I'm going to give my time to Joel, Dr. Thiessen, and we're looking to hear from you. Thank you, Dr. Thiessen, for joining us and leading us today.
It's great. Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. Give me 1 second. I'll just share my screen. All right. Thumbs up. Is that viewable on your end? Everyone's good? All right. Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for welcoming me into this virtual space as part of your assembly. I'm a sociologist of religion. I specialize in religion and culture in Canada, and I look at religious and cultural trends that have taken place in Canada on a number of fronts, as was noted, related to those who say they have no religion, millennials in Canada, and then congregations. And that's what I want to focus on today. And there's a lot of interest, rightly so, in what impact the pandemic will have on congregations moving forward. What should churches be thinking about as we move to what appears to be the tail end of the pandemic and then kind of reopening for in-person opportunities and experiences. So I want to speak to that a little bit today, but also draw upon some research out of our work at the Flourishing Congregations Institute here at Ambrose University in Calgary. And there I'm going to focus on 3 particular dynamics of our research related to innovation, leadership, and evangelism. And throughout, I'll give some attention to the pandemic as well. So please make note of any questions you might have. And then I definitely plan on giving some time at the end for some Q&A and discussion to follow from some of the things that you will see here. I want to say, just by way of introduction here, that lots has been actually written and said about the pandemic and congregations over the last year or more. And we've provided a number of resources on our website. I'll give you that website info on the next slide at the Institute connected to the pandemic. And a critical study that's come out just a couple months ago here in Canada through the Angus Reid Institute talked about religious life in Canada. And the main storyline that came out in this article and some of the data they collected is that while there have been some clear drawbacks, most in Canada say that they are doing okay spiritually. Most have remained connected to others in their congregation. Most have watched and or attended services based on regions and different formats and so forth. And most plan to return to in-person services. And I don't know if this data aligns with what you've thought or talked about or kind of pandered about with your colleagues and so forth. But I find this data actually rather encouraging. I don't think it's terribly surprising. Of course, there are all kinds of variations within that, and I encourage you to check out that study. But I just kind of want to allay some fears that some might have of what might happen. The big unknown, of course, is this is what, in part, people project they will do. And we don't know what people will actually do until that time comes. But this kind of gives us the best possible estimate heading into some post-pandemic realities. So that's kind of a backdrop for thinking about the pandemic and some of the data that we will look at here. A little bit about our work at the Institute, and this will help to frame the conversation. So our Institute is dedicated to looking at congregations in Canada. It is dedicated towards empirical data. And so I encourage you to check out our website. We provide a number of resources there, looking at Catholic, Mainline, Conservative Protestant churches across Canada, across different regions. We partner with a number of different scholars and researchers, and importantly, in a session like this, try to do things that would engage practitioners, whereby data is the hub of everything that we do, but trying to use that data in ways that would be helpful to local church and denominational leaders and so forth. And so the things I'm going to talk about today come out of our recently published book titled Signs of Life, Catholic, Mainline, and Conservative Protestant Congregations in Canada. That is linked off of our website, so you can locate it there if you're interested. You can Google and find other ways of picking up this book as well. So a little bit of background context. One other thing I'll say that might be of interest is on our website, we provide a link for a newsletter. You can sign up for it, you can unsubscribe, but basically every couple of weeks we provide blogs by church leaders and scholars of religion and congregations that hopefully will be helpful to local churches, as well as some resources, some books, podcasts, videos that might be of interest. So you can sign up for that, check out those things on our website that may also be of value to you. All right, what do we mean by flourishing congregations? This is the age-old question we consistently receive, rightly so. We've done a fair bit of research. We have interviewed and conducted focus groups with over 100 leaders across the country, across different theological contexts. We've recently completed a survey with over 250 churches and over 9,000 respondents, both leaders as well as congregants. And so we pool all this together and we write a series of things related to congregational life. I want to say a few things by way of introduction. First, there is a strong debate over the relationship between numbers and flourishing. Does a church need to grow numerically in order to actually count, if you will, quote unquote, as something that is flourishing? And some are quite adamant that a church needs to grow numerically in order to flourish. Then there's another strong camp that says, listen, you don't need to be growing numerically in order to flourish, that you might actually find various demographic realities, particularly in rural locations, for example, that make it difficult for churches to grow numerically, but we would still say we are flourishing. So we talk about this dynamic, and we certainly don't come down on one side or the other in terms of a research institute, but want to kind of paint the picture to say that both of these narratives are out there. I think there's merits to both of them in different ways, and there's probably limitations to both of them in different ways. So it is important to name that right up front. I'm not assuming that flourishing equals numeric growth per se. Second, no church flourishes in every way, and few churches are without flourishing in some way. I think sometimes we look at, large growing congregations and we assume, wow, they're like flourishing in all these ways and everything just seems to be working. But I think when you dig beneath the surface, and there's really good sociological research on this, you find that while there might be numeric growth and certainly signs of life, there are other areas where flourishing is not present, and perhaps some very unhealthy practices that exist there. Conversely, there are some churches that you would say are struggling numerically. Maybe there's all kinds of indications where flourishing is not present. And we would say in much of our research that at least in one area, or maybe a couple areas in most congregations, there's still maybe signs of life. They may be small signs of life, but there are signs of life and vitality there. And how might we learn from those and actually leverage those in different contexts? This is an anchoring premise that we work from at the Institute, that while yes, it's good to give attention to areas of weakness or limitations, how do we actually build upon the areas of strength and have more of an appreciative inquiry approach? The final thing I'll say, and this is where you see the image before you, is that the ways in which we define flourishing looks differently based on a variety of different contexts, say theological context as just one example. And so when you spend time in this context with Baptists, for example, you might look at these 11 different indicators and say, I'm not sure I would say that a flourishing congregation needs to have all of these things present. You might say, we only think that these 3 or 4 areas are particularly important to us, theologically, philosophically, and so forth. Our mandate, so to speak, as an institute is not to say do these 11 things and your church will flourish, or you must flourish in all of these areas in order to flourish. No, these are things that, as we've spoken with groups across Catholic, Mainline, and Conservative Protestant contexts, that the total sum, these seem to be the 11 things that stand out consistently as markers of flourishing within their context. And some of these are more elevated in some settings and muted in other settings. And so our research and our book and so forth is intended to help congregations to get a fuller and broader sense of these, and also to identify the ways in which these are interconnected. Discipleship is just one example, is nurtured and expressed in many other areas of a congregation's life. Something like evangelism, which we'll look at later on, neighborhood involvement, a hospitable community, all of the ways in which we practice these things, the ways in which we think about these things are in fact an extension of a discipling subculture. So we shouldn't think about these things as distinctive, set apart categories per se. All right, I mentioned we've done this large national survey. That is where a bunch of the data that I'll share today comes out of. Any sort of social scientific study, it's important to be aware of method. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. For the sake of time, you can read more about this in our book and I can answer questions afterwards. But this gives you a bit of an overview of some of the sampling elements of this project. There are more denominations that are part of this study than are listed here. These are simply the 8 denominations that were most represented within this sampling. So we reached out to denominations across the theological spectrum with an invitation to participate. So this is not a representative sample. It's very much based on those groups who agreed and were willing to fill out this survey in their congregational setting. There you see some of the provincial breakdown as well within this particular survey. And here you see a number of other demographics in terms of church size, age of those who filled out the survey from within congregational settings, smaller to larger centers. Congregations that have existed for a longer period of time definitely were far more prominent within this particular study. And then a range of groups who would say that their congregations are growing, staying the same in size, or declining. And this will become important because I'm going to make some comparisons between these three. What's interesting in our data analysis is that while we don't operate from the premise that growth equals flourishing or declining means the absence of flourishing, these 3 comparison variables, if you will, certainly stood out on many different indicators to really help distinguish different types of congregations. And so I'm going to lean into some of those for the data analysis. The final thing I'll say about method, and I know it's kind of the boring thing for those who aren't kind of stats geeks like ourselves at the Institute and others, is we provide this kind of information to demonstrate that there are certainly voices that are not present within the data, certainly not for lack of trying in terms of our part as researchers and reaching out to different groups. But for example, there aren't many new church plants that are part of this study. And so you have to keep that in mind when you look at the data. You always have to ask yourself, whose voices are not heard? And therefore, what are we hearing or potentially not hearing? And it's just a good approach to any kind of data understanding or trying to unpack that data in different contexts. And I would say as an institute and as a research team, we're unequivocally committed to wanting to learn as much as we can about different kinds of congregational settings. And so my hope, certainly over the time that we're doing this kind of work at the Institute, is that we could do some dedicated studies on church plants, for example, and try to better understand those. Or right now, we've just launched this week, you can read more about and even get involved if you want in our Institute, a national study on evangelism in Canada in partnership with Alpha Canada and a series of other organizations. So involved in various fronts that may not be captured in this single survey that we are seeing this morning together. All right, 3 themes I want to look at, and we'll focus the rest of our time and attention on this. I want to look at innovation, leadership, and evangelism. When I speak of innovation, really I'm speaking about the introduction of something new or altering something that is already established. And one of the things that we learned early on in our research at the Institute, and this is all pre-COVID, important to keep that in mind, is that congregations who were flourishing consistently had this ethos of innovation, of willing to take risks, of trying new things, of dreaming of different possibilities, and to kind of take a step, take a leap, and try some new things. Now, what has bound all congregations together over the last year or so is that we've been forced to innovate. We've been forced to try new things, to alter things that perhaps were already established, to see what might actually arise. And I would say that this is an important marker of flourishing, that one is willing to try new things and to see what happens. What was interesting to our research team as we met with church and denominational leaders across the country is that when they try new things, and let's say it doesn't work out, that they don't interpret failure as failure, but rather they interpret it as seeds for new ideas. And so this is a really important part of this innovation subculture, that you try something and it might not work out. But the question is always, what have we learned during that period of innovation? And how might that lay the seeds for a new idea that might actually work out within our particular context? A really helpful metaphor or image that we've used to think about this is this idea of getting out of the boat. And we heard about this from some of our respondents in our interview and focus group. This idea that when you get out of the boat onto the water, unsure what will actually happen, that this is an important measuring stick, if you will, for congregations who wish to flourish. What is the degree of readiness or preparedness to get out of the boat? Perhaps one of the gifts of COVID has been is it helped congregations to actually step out of the boat where they may not feel ready to do so, but maybe has created a different kind of posture moving forward. That this could be one of the greatest gifts, if you will, of the pandemic, amidst all of the understandable challenges that congregations have confronted, for actually moving forward, of embracing this as a regular part of one's DNA, if you will, for taking some steps forward in this regard. And so I want to turn to some empirical data that actually helps us to think about different kinds of congregations. This is a question that we asked, again, pre-COVID, and I just want to take a brief aside to note that we have just launched a new survey in and through our work as an institute that now includes both some questions related to the pandemic and the ways in which the pandemic has impacted congregational life, and then enhanced and strengthened some of the questions that you'll see today. And so, again, we have information on our website. We have a fee for service opportunity that if congregations wish to partake in that survey now and receive a report, or you wish to do that as a denomination on this particular region and district, that there's opportunities for that, as well as we try to help and work with congregations as well. So one of the questions that we asked on our survey: which of the following best describes your congregation? Would you say that you are resistant to change, reluctant to change, ready and willing to change, or resilient and change? And then we make comparisons here in terms of ones that seem to stand out when we compare different variables in our study between growing, staying the same, and declining congregational settings. And what you find is that those in growing congregations, over 80% said that they were either ready and willing to change or resilient in change, in contrast to 44% of those in declining congregations along those two indicators. Now, this alone doesn't mean that a congregation will actually change or that they will be resilient in change. But it does reveal a bit of a marker of how congregations, kind of their disposition toward change. And disposition matters. When you think about change, and this is important coming out of the pandemic, when you think about what will life be like post-pandemic, you need to have a bit of a barometer on what is the pulse of our congregation. Are most people resistant to change? Are they reluctant? Are they ready and willing? Because that barometer helps you assess within a congregational setting how we might approach change. And different congregations function differently there. Right? You'll have early adopters, you'll have late adopters, you'll have non-adopters. So paying attention to that is important for congregational life. And it seems that growing congregations generally have a disposition that leans far more readily and in resilient ways toward change than those in declining contexts. So this might be a helpful starting point for those who might be in, say, a congregation that's more resistant or reluctant to change, to begin to create some opportunities for conversation around what is the current pulse, What are the potential barriers or areas of resistance, and how might we slowly and readily engage those things? And again, I think the pandemic has maybe been a bit of a gift for congregations to catapult groups into some of these spaces. Another question that we asked groups, again pre-COVID, if a person was away from your parish or congregation for 3 years and then came back, to what extent might they notice changes in how things are done? And again, you find in growing congregations, you have over 90% who say that they would find many noticeable changes or a few noticeable changes. And this in contrast to about 70% of those in declining context. Now, I need to make clear that not all change is good. Not all change is beneficial for organizational life. I'm not suggesting that groups just need to change constantly, find the latest and greatest thing, and then kind of follow it there and follow it there. No, this is not at all the takeaway that one should make from here. But there is an attentiveness to one's surrounding culture and environment that changes, that congregations operate out of, that demographics change within a congregation, neighborhoods change. And what are the ways in which congregations would be attentive to those things and adapt and innovate perhaps in response to those things? And again, I think the pandemic has been a great opportunity for groups to actually do these things and to do so in sensible and targeted and intentional ways, I would say above all, relative to the core identity of a congregation. What is the reason that your church exists for? What draws this community of faith together? And how might those things actually guide the kinds of decisions that one might make towards introducing or making various changes within congregational life? And so a few questions that I offer to you as points of reflection, either for you personally, for your congregation, your leadership group. These might even be things that you want to take back to your group following our session today. Where are the opportunities for your church to experiment? Importantly, relative to your core vision or identity. There's many different possibilities. We provide a variety of ideas within our book. The point is not what those particular ideas are, because experimentation will look different for different congregations, depending on their history, depending on the demographics of who attends your church, who's in your neighborhood. All these kinds of things matter. But I think it's important to ask the question and then to brainstorm and take some steps towards those areas of experimentation. Second, what are the new and imaginative on-ramps for people to be connected or get involved? This is a really pressing question at the best of times, but particularly during the pandemic. A question that many are asking is, how do people actually connect or reconnect to our congregation as we transition to more in-person opportunities in the coming months? What are the on-ramps? How would a person get connected to your congregation? And how would you draw them into deeper levels of engagement? We know that the number one reason a person joins a religious community is that they have been invited by someone who's part of that religious community. We also know that things like websites, for example, are critical points of connection for people to learn something about a church, particularly when they move into a new neighborhood or community or to a new city and are trying to learn about the church, churches available in that area. And so those provide your first point of contact. But then it's up to the church and its structures and processes to actually provide on-ramps to draw people in. How would a person get involved? How would they get to know others who are part of the community? And so there's a variety of ways in which groups might do that, whether it's filling out communication cards, having in sort of non-COVID times, potlucks or some kind of meal gatherings once a month. If you're new to our church, you want to learn a bit more about our church, meet some other people, on the first Sunday of every month, we're going to have this opportunity. So these kinds of things might provide different kinds of on-ramps. So lots of different ideas to arise there. And then how might board and finance decisions actually help to equip and or empower staff and lay leaders to try new initiatives? I can't stress this enough. It is one thing to come up with innovative ideas, and it's quite another to actually help to set those innovative ideas up for success. How do the decisions we make and the financial decisions as well that we make available actually empower folks for success with innovative ideas? This might mean saying no to these things because we want to turn our direction to these things without knowing if it will actually succeed or not. I think this is important to help groups to actually say, if we're going to take this step, we're going to commit. It doesn't mean you have to be all in per se. It might be a gradual, progressive step, but you actually want to provide resources to give it a best shot at actually succeeding. And again, to not interpret failure as failure, but rather seeds for new ideas. So a few questions that hopefully are helpful as we think about innovation, both during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. A second area that I want to speak to that matters not only through the pandemic, but broadly speaking in congregational life, pertains to leadership. Now, we could say a lot of things about leadership. A lot of books have been written about leadership. And I want to focus on one particular aspect, on a concept known as keychain leadership. Now, this image that you see before you is from a metaphor from a book titled Growing Young. A group of scholars and researchers at the Fuller Youth Institute looked at congregations that had a lot of younger people who were part of their congregation and wanted to simply answer the question, why is that? What are some of the dynamic traits that are part of some congregations with a youthful presence? And among the 6 things they talked about keychain leadership. And it is the idea that there are certain members within congregations that have the physical keys to the building, the physical keys to enter the church, the different rooms within the church, and so forth. And keys represent power. Those who are in positions of leadership have access to those physical keys. And this metaphor really asks the question, who are you passing those keys on to? Who are you sharing those keys with? In other words, who are you developing and training as leaders and actually passing on to others? And that the vibrancy and vitality of a congregation, both short and long term, depends upon congregations and leaders who are passing that leadership on to others. If I could be so bold as to say that if you or others are in positions of leadership and holding the keys and are holding them so tightly and unwilling to hand those keys over, to release the power and to release leadership to others, that this might be the first indication that you should not be in a position of leadership. That this is actually a problematic and toxic posture for leadership and leadership development within congregations. And so I want to share a few things out of our research that really spells out this concept. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see a quotation from one of the leaders that we spent some time with in the Maritime provinces. And they said, quote, "We have a number of parishes, this is a mainline Protestant context, a number of parishes that are unable to afford full-time clergy leadership. And even some of the larger parishes that have had multiple staff are declining in number of staff members. We recognize the need to be more intentional about identifying lay leaders and empowering and releasing them," end quote. In this context, and perhaps for many, it comes out of necessity. We don't have enough leaders, and so we need to intentionally think about this to actually sustain our organization short and long term. Others respond to this out of a posture of burnout, not a good catalyst, I would say, for leadership development, but it can, in the end, actually lead to leadership development, whereby leaders are burnt out. And if we don't train other leaders, we actually can't sustain ourselves individually or as an organization. The best and healthiest posture is to avoid either of these circumstances where burnout isn't the default position, and or we're dealing with a lack of leaders overall, but really to embed within the DNA of an organization and congregation that we deeply value and desire that for everyone who's in positions of leadership, whether paid or volunteer, whether as a senior leader, whether as a ministry leader over different ministry areas, that everyone who's in leadership should intentionally have an eye towards building and investing in the next group of leaders. In other words, you almost want to build yourself out of a job, whether in a volunteer or paid capacity, thinking about succession and including others as part of congregational life. And so here are some questions that we've asked as part of our survey work. Our pastoral and church leaders take seriously the advice and ideas offered by attendees in our congregation. This question is not the only question on leadership. We'll look at a series of others, but it does reveal a posture on how open or receptive leaders are to those that they are leading that actually can convey something about the inclusion of different members of the community, different gifts within the community towards the congregation as a whole. And here you see some stark differences between growing congregations and declining congregations in those who agree or strongly agree. Now, it has to be said, and you will know this as church leaders and practitioners, that not all advice and ideas offered by those within one's congregation is good advice or helpful ideas. And this is where leaders need to discern wisely and prudently of what advice is actually worth taking. Some research has come out during the pandemic here that articulates that leaders of congregations during the pandemic, one of the number one strains they confront are the tensions from those within their congregation who are offering their advice or ideas, or more pointedly, their critiques of leaders of how well or not well they have responded to the pandemic and restrictions and so forth. We should do this, or we shouldn't do that. And so you have to hold these things in tension. But the underlying idea is the posture towards being receptive to ideas from those within and to communicate well within that context. Next, pastoral and church leaders in our congregation appear to delegate or share tasks with others. This is that keychain leadership idea. Do I hold to it tightly, or am I willing and actually take steps to delegate and share tasks? Again, you see marked differences between growing and declining contexts. There are many other benefits to delegating and sharing tasks beyond just leadership development. There's something about empowering and equipping the laity and the saints for ministry within congregational life. That when leaders take on everything and do everything themselves, even though it might appear easier at certain points in time, we're actually debilitating the larger community of faith from living into the things that God has gifted them with their strengths and capacities and passions and so forth. And so we talk about elsewhere in our research and in our book on the benefits of having an equipped and empowered laity who are engaged in a variety of ways. And that congregations who include others have many other benefits for congregational life. It gives a sense of community, a sense of ownership, a sense of using one's gift, along with a deeper sense of buy-in and commitment to one's local congregational setting. Next, we asked developing sort of the extent to which one is developing new non-pastoral leaders as ongoing within our congregation. And here we really see this larger chasm between growing and declining contexts. Yes, there are different settings, different postures that congregations can take based on their size and demographics and skill sets, etc. But I think this is an underlying thing that can happen whether you're a larger congregation or a smaller congregation, and whether you're growing or declining. This is a matter of posture, a matter of getting the right people on the bus, so to speak, in positions of leadership who value this so deeply that it infuses everything that they are doing. And again, if you're in a position of leadership, who are those that you are developing within your sphere of ministry? How are you passing the baton, handing over keys to others within your setting? A few things specific to COVID and leadership development, some of the things that we've noted within this context. I've noted already some of the research that's come out on pressure points for church leaders. This came out of a study in the US, and we've posted a number of these under the resources section if you're interested on our website. But one of the central pressure points for church leaders pertains to complaints or conflict or unity on how to respond to the pandemic. In fact, this was data that was gathered at the end of last summer. I've seen other data since then, even within the Angus Reid study that I noted earlier from April 2021 here, that talks about these political divisions within churches, different political views on government restrictions, different views on how their church has or hasn't responded, whether they should or shouldn't have had in-person opportunities or more online opportunities or particular types of opportunities. This is a heavy burden to bear for church leaders. And it's something that no doubt many of you have experienced firsthand. And it's important for congregations to be attentive to these things and for leaders to respond, as difficult as it is, with as much grace and care and compassion for those within the congregation who are coming from different perspectives and experiences themselves navigating through the pandemic. Leadership matters. How will we lead coming out of the pandemic? How will we navigate diversity within our own congregational settings that can be fairly divisive or has the potential to be? The other pressure point for church leaders has been pastoral care. How do I care for my flock, so to speak, when we can't gather in person? And I think this has opened up an opportunity for leadership development, and some churches have taken this up during the pandemic to actually equip and empower the laity for pastoral care. It's not the same per se, but it does provide a different form of when I'm now calling others within my congregation, reaching out to others within my church to see how they're doing, to check in on their family. These kinds of things that were more common early on in the pandemic when there was a lot of uncertainty, potentially can unleash a culture of care for one another in a congregation that doesn't just default that to the pastor or church leaders. In terms of ways to develop leaders or to empower leaders and things that we might think of coming out of the pandemic, I've alluded to some of these things that the ways that we might do this can actually help to foster lay engagement by intentionally tapping the shoulders of others within our areas of ministry, of personally inviting others into areas of it might be volunteering or leadership overall, that these things can actually help with different forms of lay engagement, particularly coming out of the pandemic as churches grapple with how engaged or unengaged will people be. One of the gateways, one of the pathways might be, we'd like to invite you to help us with some different volunteer type things. Maybe it's like a big church clean or a property cleanup, or we need to do a series of things to get us up and running, or community block parties, and all these kinds of things. It might be a one-off commitment thing for people, but this can help just gradually draw people in. And as I noted earlier, the more you are developing leaders and drawing others in, it means the load in theory is lighter for your central leaders at the top. You can help to avoid leader burnout by actually sharing and redistributing some of the leadership involvement so that it's not constantly pointed towards one person or a few people within the organization. All right, third and finally, and then after this, we'll open it up for some Q&A, and looking forward to things perhaps that I haven't addressed that you want to hear more about, and a variety of other topics. Evangelism. We know sociologically that congregations grow in one of three ways. First, transfer growth. That is, people leave a church in one city, and within the same city, they go to another church, right? So they left, I won't name denominations, they leave this denominational church and they go to that denominational church, or they leave this church within the denomination to a different church within the denomination. This is one way that churches grow. Transfer growth also includes those who move from, say, Toronto to Calgary, and they attended a church in Toronto and now they're looking for a church in Calgary. This contributes to transfer growth. It also might come through immigration. You know, people attended churches in a different country outside of Canada, they immigrated to Canada and now are looking for a church here. We know that immigration is a key contributor to what is happening in congregational life today, particularly immigration from the global south and east into evangelical and Catholic churches. So that's kind of one big bucket. Transfer growth contributes to congregational growth. Second, births and retention. That is, the more children you have and the church's ability to retain those children, this can contribute to growth. And so we know from different demographic patterns that some religious groups have more children than others, some do a better job of retaining children than others. Evangelical groups, broadly speaking, which would include Baptists, tend to do on the whole a better job of retaining children than some other traditions. And so this contributes to growth as well. And then third, conversion, and this connects to the conversation on evangelism. And here I borrow some of my research on those who say they have no religion, or what we call in sociology, religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. This is among the fastest growing, quote unquote, religious group in Canada, the United States, and the modern Western world today. 24% of Canadian adults, 32% of Canadian teenagers say they have no religion. When we talk about evangelism, when we talk about conversion, we know that this is one leg of the stool by which churches might potentially grow. Those who say they have no religion, and or more broadly speaking, those from religious traditions outside of one's faith group who convert into that faith group, can be a primary vehicle or avenue to actually grow that group. I won't go into all of the details here, but transfer growth is the leading pathway for churches who actually grow in terms of the empirical data. It is primarily one of those who are leaving other churches who join sort of the latest, greatest church that seems to have a lot of things going for it. That is primarily what grows congregations. It is not conversion. Conversion is actually a relatively small portion of congregational growth, but it is one of the legs of the stool, and it is something that we pay attention to, particularly in flourishing congregations, because as we spoke with congregations who say they're flourishing, they spoke about evangelism as being an important marker of the kinds of things that they are doing within their setting. And so I want to raise a few possibilities and a few data points that would help us understand what potentially is taking place within these settings. So our congregation gives a high or essential priority to evangelism. We know as social scientists, as sociologists, that we don't just look to behaviors, but we look at beliefs, and we look at the extent to which a group values something. And so the extent to which we give a higher essential priority to evangelism, you find on the left-hand side that those in growing congregations are more likely to give a high or essential priority than those in declining congregations. This does not mean that they actually evangelize. We'll look at some data in a moment. And it also does not mean that they are necessarily effective in their evangelism. It just means that they give a greater priority. And I would say sociologically that this is part of your bedrock. If you don't give it a priority, then you're going to have very few things that are going to follow thereafter in terms of actual practice or behavior. So a priority does, in fact, matter. I want to single out that group on the far right-hand side, those who say they are neutral or unsure about whether their congregation gives a high or essential priority, ranging from 22 to 29%. Sometimes when you look at data, you might overlook that neutral or unsure category, kind of say, well, it doesn't really tell us anything because they don't really know what they think on this particular topic. But I would say that it actually tells us a lot, particularly on this question. If you have around a quarter or more of your congregation who says, we're not sure whether our congregation gives a higher central priority to evangelism, at the very least, it probably tells you that your church does not give a higher essential priority, right? If your congregation is not clear on what those high priorities are, that will tell you something about how either effective or ineffective we've been in communicating those priorities or our actual practices. There's obviously a disconnect between those two things. And so I think that is a telling thing for congregations to think about. Next, we asked respondents to indicate the frequency with which they evangelize in a variety of ways, the extent to which they show their faith to non-Christians, verbally share their faith with non-Christians, or invite non-Christians to church. And these aren't the best or only metrics. In fact, I would say the survey that we just launched this week on evangelism, we have a whole range, broader and deeper way of trying to tap into this. And again, would encourage you and your congregations to fill that out. It's just a short 10-minute survey where I think we'll have a far deeper and broader sense. So I would say this kind of survey version 1.0 kind of give us an entrance point into this that gives a few ideas on what's potentially happening here. So I want to begin with this showing faith, this idea that I show my faith to others with the idea that it might actually reveal something about my faith in Christianity that might invite others into this faith that I'm part of. 95% monthly or more say they show their faith. So this might be, in my own context, I have a 92-year-old neighbor. When I go and shovel her sidewalk, for example, this is a way of showing my faith to my neighbor. Or you do something kind or generous for a coworker, and so forth. Very high rate. People feel quite comfortable doing so. Then verbally sharing my faith with non-Christians with the intent that might actually invite them into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, for example. Still a relatively high proportion here. 71% do this monthly or more who share their faith. Again, this is a sample across Catholic, Mainline, and Conservative Protestant settings, but less common than showing their faith. And then inviting to church, 17%. Now, I noted earlier, one of the number one reasons a person joins a religious community or attends a church, for example, is that they have personally been invited into that community of faith from those who are connected to that faith community. I'm not here to kind of publicly praise or shame any single group or group of people and how you think about these, but I do want to provide a sociological analysis of what might be in play here. I think there's something interesting in what I might call a more passive form of evangelism to a more assertive form of evangelism. Showing my faith. It's a fairly passive thing. I can shovel my neighbor's walk. I can do some good deeds, some kind things to others. And the question I would ask sociologically, and even theologically, not that we shouldn't do these things, is how effective is this as a primary gateway or form of evangelism? If I were to ask you, when is the last time someone asked you why you're a nice, kind person? When was the last time that someone actually asked you those things? I couldn't actually tell you when someone asked me that, which might mean that I'm not a nice, kind, pleasant person, which I just want to set that aside for a moment as an implausible explanation here. Or it might actually align with this reality that most people generally are just kind of kind, good-hearted people who do nice things for other people. Maybe it's part of this Canadian DNA, I don't know. Point being, the more passive form of evangelism might not be as effective in terms of actually stepping out and either sharing one's faith or inviting one to one's church. There's a lot more that we could say here. I know there are limitations with this particular metric. And again, I think the survey we just released will help to tease out a whole series of other evangelistic methods. But I do think at the core that there is a more passive approach to evangelism in a Canadian context. I think people are leery about this for a variety of reasons that we'll look at in a moment that connects with a broad Canadian culture that is maybe more leery or reticent on this particular indicator. And this, I think, dovetails with this question, challenges for me personally in evangelism. We gave a whole list of potential challenges, and we asked individuals to identify up to 3 that they would say were particularly challenging for them. And here you see the top 5 that were accounted for. And so these won't add up to 100% because people could indicate more than one. Lack of confidence, 42%. Increased antagonism or resistance to Christian values in the Christian church, 34%. This idea that perhaps Christianity is more of an outsider to Canadian culture and society, at least this is the perception for some. Fear of rejection, 29%. Few non-believers as friends, 25%. And lack of training, 23%. If I were looking at this data as a church leader, I would begin asking myself the question, what role do we as a church have to help fill in some of these gaps or address some of these gaps for those in congregational settings? How might we equip and empower folks so that they don't lack confidence, so they don't lack the training that they might need, so they don't fear rejection per se? I think groups can come alongside and actually help congregants. Few know how to evangelize or what it is, and live within a Canadian context whereby evangelism has a whole set of baggage associated with it. Are very leery to do so because we don't want to offend, we don't want to be exclusive. All these narratives that exist within a broadly inclusive, tolerant, multicultural Canadian society. That is the backdrop that we think about evangelism within. And so lots could be said. Maybe we'll pick up some of these things in the Q&A, but I think this gives us a helpful touch point for how some within the pews in particular are thinking about or approaching some of the challenges that they confront when it comes to evangelism. And so some final questions to consider, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. How central is evangelism in your congregation? Thinking about that earlier question of to what extent is this a priority? Is it a priority or not? I'm not here to tell you that this needs to be a priority. I'm simply here to say that it's one of those 11 markers of evangelism that congregations who are flourishing have indicated have been central to their flourishing. And so if this is theologically significant for you, and if you believe that this is something that you want to be an important part of your DNA, how central is it? How central is it to your teaching? The extent to which you actually teach about and preach about these things? How central is it to the ways in which you equip people? Equipping people for evangelism can take on a myriad of forms, whether it's training sessions and seminars and workshops, tapping into different parachurch organizations and resources that can be helpful here. Are there actual opportunities for evangelism in and through your congregation? Sometimes individuals need a bit of an on-ramp where you say as a congregation, we're going to run this alpha program, for example, and we want to encourage you to invite others in. And so this provides an opportunity that can invite people within your congregation into those evangelistic spaces and contexts. Those opportunities provide a bit of a platform. To what extent do we celebrate those who are new to the faith? There's a powerful place for testimonies, for people who have newly come to faith to actually share, to witness to the rest of the community. It helps those who are new to the faith, both in helping to solidify a new identity, so to speak, as they join this faith community, but it also helps to reinforce to the rest of the community of the joy and the transformation that we see in those who have come to faith in and through Jesus Christ and in through one's local church, that those celebrations actually matter. And they fulfill different social functions for the group as a whole. And it also reminds me, sitting in the pew, all right, this is part of what we do. This is part of why we do what we do. And this is an exciting dynamic. And am I doing these things in my own neighborhood and workplace and family settings and so forth? And then finally, measurements. Do we actually measure or count the number of people who come to faith in and through our congregation? And some might become quite reticent about actually quantifying and measuring things. But I would say one of the strengths of measurement is it helps us to assess those things that we believe are important. If we believe that evangelism is important, and you look at the ledger sheet every year, and you have 0 converts, 0 converts, 0 baptisms, etc., one must ask the question, if this is important, what might we do to actually change some of the results? What is going on here? How might we equip and empower people? What's going on in society? And these kinds of things. And so I think measurement does matter. It's not the end all and be all, but it can be an important marker for paying attention to what is happening in this dynamic. So I want to say, just by way of conclusion, and we'll open it up for Q&A, flourishing is multifaceted. There are many different dynamics in play. The pandemic in particular, I think, has opened up new opportunities. For congregations who were flourishing before the pandemic, my hunch is that most will have continued to flourish in part because they're doing a number of the things that we see within that construct that we noted earlier on. I think there are others who have actually started to flourish in new ways because of the pandemic. It has forced groups to take some steps that for various reasons weren't taken prior to the pandemic. And if this opportunity is maximized and utilized moving forward, can actually be a significant catalyst toward flourishing. And then there are those for whom the pandemic has actually grounded or halted some of the ministry activities, where maybe even some who were flourishing before have taken a step back. And perhaps this has been for a variety of reasons, whether it's resources and concerns there, or levels of connection and community with others within one's congregation, that this really is a restart opportunity. What does that look like moving forward? And my strongest word of advice, if you will, is to listen well to those within your congregation. What is the pulse of that congregation right now? Where are people? Where are their reservations? What are they excited about? What would they like to see happen? What do they miss? What would they like to pick up? And to just listen and learn, and to not rush forward too quickly. You will have a diversity of perspectives and experiences. And so it takes careful and good leadership to listen well, and then to take some tangible steps forward that would help in those areas that you would say are supremely important for what is distinctive to your congregation. So I hope these things are helpful. Again, encourage you to check out my website and linked off to our Flourishing Congregations one, where you can see more about research on congregations, those who say they have no religion, millennials, and so forth. So I will stop talking. I've done a lot of that here so far, and happy to open it up for Q&A. And Paul, we'll hand it back to you then.
Well, I'm going to hand it back to you in a minute, actually. So, Dr. Thiessen, thank you so much for sharing that. And I took lots of notes. It was very helpful. And actually, just thinking about much of what you said really is calling us to be better Baptists. You're calling us to be a priesthood of all believers, to empower the next generation. And really, as a priesthood, we're called to listen to one another. And it's very human to do that. It's not just Christian, but it's very human. And God made us all human. So the welcoming of new people and is a huge part of our church. Is an openness to new ideas. A lot of great things here. I just wanted to kind of add, for me, I'm working with churches a lot, and I hear a lot of quotes from them. And sometimes the older generation says, people don't want to serve. I wanted to hear, what are your thoughts about that when, our job is to innovate, to change, to flourish, to adapt. And we want to empower the next generation, but they don't want to serve. They don't want to help out. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of different things potentially in play here. I think people want to serve and give to things that they believe in. And so I think part of the entrance point is, what is the mission and the heartbeat that draws us together? And how does serving and volunteering actually help us collectively to embody and experience and realize that particular vision and mission? So I think that core identity piece is one of the first things in that little wheel that I showed earlier on. Can be particularly helpful. I think too, personal invitation is key here. When you do kind of the general call out, we need volunteers for X, Y, or Z, you might sort of get a few people, but I think we all know from experience that generally speaking, that doesn't happen. And this in part is a function of group size, right? If it's an anonymous call and we know, well, there's other people who receive that and others could probably step up, then the pressure is off on me. But when you come to me personally and say, hey, Joel, we have a need in this area, and I think that your skills and gifts would be particularly advantageous. I know this out of personal experience in my own church context, as well as working with other churches, that not everyone will say yes. And you also don't want to get to the point where you're guilting people into serving. But it does create something out of relationship. And I think that matters. And it matters that we are looking for people to serve in areas of skill and passion and capacity. That sometimes I think that a downside of some churches is we're just looking for a warm body and here's a need and now we're going to bring these two together. But this is actually problematic because you might have the wrong people serving in the wrong area. So I'm a drummer, for example, and so you don't want me singing, but you do want me drumming. And if you ask me to sing because you need a singer and I'm a warm body, this will be problematic on many fronts. And I think sometimes we do that in congregational settings. And those bad experiences can actually limit people from wanting to volunteer or serve moving forward. So those are a few things that I would say. It might be an unwillingness, and this will be interesting. I don't know what will happen post-pandemic. On one hand, we might feel that people have sort of COVID fatigue. Everyone's tired of many things because of the different restrictions, et cetera. And yet on the other hand, you might have others who are like, let's get this thing going and you tell me what you need. And so I think paying attention to those differences, I think you might have a strong reserve of people who are willing to get up and serve, but it needs to be targeted. It needs to be focused. We need volunteers in these areas, and it's helping us to accomplish these missional things that we believe God has called our congregation for this time and place. And it can be a rallying cry. And it can actually help to engage people, both short and I would say long-term as well. And those, again, this will bring us full circle, brings us back to leadership development. How are we inviting people in and fostering and nurturing leaders and relationships within that? So how do we treat people and treat people well within those contexts out of relationships? So some initial thoughts anyways.
There's a job of listening to them actually when they say no.
Yes.
And that is a gift that we provide. And actually, one of our attendees asked, do you see hesitancy to attend church when the pandemic is over?
Yeah, great question. So that Angus Reid study that I cited earlier on, suggests that most people who attended religious services regularly before the pandemic fully anticipate that they will attend post-pandemic. So we'll find out if that actually happens. We don't know until it actually happens. Yes, there are some who have kind of drifted off. We know it's been comfortable to sit in our pajamas and coffee on our couch on Sunday mornings or what have you to watch services. And so breaking out of that rhythm, it is a habit. This will be a relearned habit. And like any kind of habit, it takes time. And people will have different comfort levels, right? Few, if any of us, have been in large crowds or settings for a very long time. And it is a cognitive shift. So we need to give space and allow for that. There will be some who will prefer to remain online for a period of time, maybe indefinitely, but I think the data suggests that will not be the norm. Okay, that most do not want that. Most do want to actually resume in-person services and attend that. I think the question and the opportunity and the challenge for local churches is to say, why would a person attend in person with us moving forward?
Yeah.
What is the great gift, the opportunity that comes through our gathering of weekly services? And I think there's some overarching, both theological and social responses that might be provided. But then there are distinctive things to local churches that set this church apart from others. And I think only local churches can answer that. But what's important is to clearly articulate that in an invitational, hospitable, and gracious context that makes people want to actually be part of that. And that again grows out of personal relationship.
Amen.
What are the personal social ties that we have that invites people into that? And it isn't just kind of a general call of, hey, everyone, our doors are open and now you should all come, and that will work for some. But there's also the personal social ties that I think are critical to that as well.
It kind of makes me think of a Trinitarian ecclesiology. We're drawn in by this relational person, social trinity, and our churches are really social, actually. It's not just programs that we offer. It's so crucial. That is going to be really key. I think of actually from not being in church at all, virtual church, to being reopening. And how do you think that we can ease churches or our people back into that? Because you're talking about, this unlearning this habit and relearning the habit of being in person. And I'm kind of worried that people may not want to come back at all, like just maybe stay with virtual or just kind of quit church. So how do you think we can ease people back into being a part of the life of the church in physical forms with touch and things like that? So
yeah, I think first and foremost, it's important for church leaders to clearly communicate that there is space for people of different comfort levels and perspectives. And so that for some, this might take longer to actually become comfortable to resume in-person attendance and to state that that is okay. Yeah. And for those for whom they're ready, doors are open, we welcome you. So I think that's key. I think providing different opportunities to bring people together in different settings and formats will also be key. And the summer could be a great opportunity for that, right? And there's regional restrictions and variations as those lift in different ways. But, throwing a barbecue or a potluck or a picnic, even if it's just bringing your own food, but you can gather outdoors and see people again. That for some, that informal type of setting might be a helpful gateway towards resuming in-person services. I think one of the greatest gifts, if you will, of the pandemic is we've learned that Sunday morning is not the end all and be all of everything that brings a faith community together. And so if churches too quickly default to that of, well, this is it, folks, now we're back to what it used to be, then I actually fear what groups will miss out on all these other kind of avenues for getting together. So I think some other opportunities to just informally get together with people, doing those things over the summer. I'll share a few things our church has done. Not that our church has it figured out, but a couple of things. So here in Calgary, there's a bunch of food trucks that will gather at different locations. And so our church just kind of called the Food Truck Association and say, what would it look like if you brought a bunch of your food trucks on our parking lot? It's no liability or risk to us, but it just provides a space for people to come together in physically distant ways, etc. Not just for our own church members, but for those in our community and neighborhood. And so this has just provided an opportunity as restrictions have ebbed and flowed over the last year, and we'll do it through the summer here. For people from the church to just come out on a Thursday night. The food trucks are there, and it's a way of reconnecting that sort of reminds everyone that, yes, I'm still here and so are you. And we're connected to this thing called whatever our church is, and those kinds of things. So I think those are a few areas. I think providing explicit space for people to just talk about their experiences personally and or as a church, to invite people's reflections on what would you envision for this next season of life, that I think listening and creating distinct opportunities for that would be wise for churches to do. And that might take some time. Hosting some focus groups, for example, which is just kind of a fancy way at talking about just bring like 6 to 8 to 12 people together and host a bunch of those across your church and different segments of your church to just listen and learn. That can both help people internally to just hear from one another, to know that I'm not alone perhaps in my thoughts, but also a sense that they're actually gradually connecting to people in the process of sharing their thoughts and experiences. And I think it can help leaders as well. So a few things, I'm sure there's many other things that churches can do as well, but some gradual things for sure.
What I'm hearing from you actually is the use of power is really crucial in churches, really empowering leaders, but also when you listen to people and take seriously what they're saying, you're also sharing power.
Yeah.
It's such a crucial part of church. So thank you so much for that. Actually, I'm wondering, a question from Wendy, could you please speak about better ways of equipping people for evangelism? So what are better ways to equip people for evangelism in the local church?
Yeah, this is a great question. Here and maybe I should state this right at the outset in terms of, I mean, yes, I'm providing hopefully some helpful insights and stuff, but coming very much as a scholar first and foremost, and not as much a practitioner on these things. So now I'm punching above my weight class, drawing on some of the other literature that I've read. But I think just helping congregants know the ABCs of their faith, first and foremost. I think there's lots of theological research that reveals that there's a very impoverished theological understanding of one's faith among most in the pews across Canada. And this isn't just one single tradition or denomination. And so for pastors and church leaders, you are very much resident theologians. What is the theology that we are shaping our congregants with? How are we helping people to understand the essence of their faith and to be able to articulate that? So I think that is a starting point. I think too, just creating space to be in relationship with those outside of one's faith community. I think the danger of being well connected to one's local church is all of our connections are through the local church, and we spend all of our time in local church settings. Maybe the pandemic has created ways for getting to know one's neighbors. Getting to know one's neighbors, coworkers, extended family members, like these kinds of settings, I think are key to just opening up space and opportunities. I think there are some who talk about different community and block party type things. And so there's some great work by Preston Couteau. Some of you are maybe familiar. He's written a book, The Bees of Rainbow Falls, and just released another book in this last year. But he talks about the importance of community and neighborhood, where it's not about me coming necessarily to the gift and to the community and offering a gift, but rather finding where God is already at work and how do I join in with that in my community. And that just comes out of relationship, being in community with one's neighbors and community around them. And then out of that, and maybe this is more to the question then, how do I actually share my faith? I think those things can and should grow naturally out of relationship, but it necessitates that one knows enough about their faith and is equipped in and through maybe their local church on how to share that faith. And then in and through those personal relationships, which take time. One needs to discern well and be attentive in those contexts to in and through your neighborhood and community and family and coworkers and so forth, to speak words of life and truth and wisdom. I think people will know when to take that step to invite them into either considering a personal relationship with Christ, into faith communities. I think this is really important. I think initiatives like Alpha and others that can invite people into those larger settings that you can learn from others, engage in conversation and dialogue in a non-threatening way. I think those things can be quite helpful. And I know it sounds like I'm just kind of one walking billboard today for these different initiatives, but I'm really hopeful about this survey that we're doing this summer on evangelism with Alpha and a series of other groups, because I'm hopeful that it'll give us sort of the most robust set of data and information on evangelism in Canada specifically, that will help us then to help church leaders and congregants, so forth, to actually answer some of these questions on what is happening, what isn't happening, what has been particularly effective, and what are the tangible next steps. And we can really only do that work as people fill out that survey and help us to give us really good data to then inform the practice. And so hopefully we can make some modest or even great contributions to some of those steps moving forward.
I love how you shared that there is a process when people come to faith, that it's not just sometimes for people feel pressure to seal the deal, to get them to accept Christ right now. And that's a lot of pressure that's undue. It's not actually coming from God. There is actually a patient way of being present in the community, in the neighborhood, as you shared. So thank you so much for that. If you, Christians don't have crystal balls, but if you were to have maybe a sociologist, your own sociological crystal ball, what would the future of the church look like? I know right now, people have, I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking about big church, people are gravitating toward the big box stores. Maybe the big box churches or small churches close. What's going to be happening as you think about the future of the church post-pandemic life?
Yeah. So the standard caveat that all sociologists will say is we don't have the crystal ball, we aren't prognosticators, but we say sort of with all the best information available at hand, here's some things that we would say are some kind of educated anticipation. So I would say first, great diversity in terms of large churches and small churches and everything in between. And I think it's important for everyone to hear that large is not necessarily better, and nor is small necessarily worse. There are immense strengths to be found in both ends of that continuum in different contexts. I think both will be present. Some are drawn towards smaller churches, and some are drawn to larger churches for different reasons. I think that will persist, and without any inherently being better or worse than another. Second, I alluded to this briefly before on the role of immigration. Most may not realize that 40 to 50% of immigrants to Canada today come already identifying as Christian and highly involved in Christian communities in country of origin. And Christianity has always been the #1 religion among immigrants to Canada. And this is changing. We are seeing fewer immigrants coming to Canada identify as Christian, and we're seeing more who identify with traditions outside of Christianity or who say they have no religion. But we know that conservative Protestant and Catholic groups are profoundly impacted by immigration today. And the extent to which churches and organizations pay attention to that will probably determine the next 30 to 50 years of congregational or denominational life. And that includes both ethnic as well as multi-ethnic congregations. And both of those arise in connection to immigration. So that is definitely a piece worth paying attention to moving forward. I would say relative to the pandemic, this has maybe amplified or accelerated some things. It is critically important for churches to be looking outward. If you have or continue to operate out of this narrative that build it and they will come, that is an old narrative that is not pertinent any longer. We look at the growth of those who say they have no religion, increasingly those who are raised without no religion. It's not even those who have left a faith of their childhood years. We're talking about those who are raised with no religion, have no familiarity whatsoever. This is a different context. And so churches need to be looking outward, need to be thinking in a very missional narrative, have almost a missionary context. And so neighborhood involvement is absolutely imperative. Would our neighborhood notice if our church was no longer here? This is the classic question. We unearthed some data in our chapter on this question. In what ways, as we come out of the pandemic, are churches engaging their neighborhood and community, perhaps for the first time ever, and perhaps in renewed ways, or maybe a continuation of what you've done before and during the pandemic? I think this is absolutely essential. And partnering with other groups and organizations in the community to not be fearful of, but to actually partner with. So I'm sure I could give a list of 100 things, but those would be a few things I think are top of mind to pay attention to.
I'm thankful for your crystal ball.
Yes. Well, we'll see. So
actually, I just wanted to just kind of narrow in a little question. I think you talked about ethnic diversity, cultural diversity as part of the future of the church. And I think for me also, male and female leadership of the church is going to be crucial. I guess from me, I'm thinking about Western culture has shaped so much of the church. So how do we now, create a more collaborative space where it's not just Western culture or, white churches shaping the churches, but really just, oh, it's going to look different. And how do you create an openness on both ends? Because, one has traditionally been in charge, like so many churches. I think for me, the most powerful um, ecclesiologist, I guess if you would share, is Bill Hybels has shaped the church in
Right.
practical ways. He shaped the church. And he's not teaching in a seminary, but he is a church theologian that people have followed and copied and mimicked. But I guess any thoughts around how do you deconstruct but reconstruct a church that would embrace other cultures and not just centered on Western culture?
Yeah. So we have a whole chapter on diversity, and diversity means different things. I think sometimes people assume it means racial or ethnic diversity, and
Yes.
that is one piece. But we're talking, you alluded to gender, gender and leadership. Talk about age, different age groups who are represented across an organization. As we spend time with different denominations, of course, there's different theological areas of emphasis. So there will be variation within that. We look at social class. To what extent are different social classes represented within our congregation and leadership structure? So all of those things factor into how do we structure and govern our organization? So if I were to ask you right now about your board or leadership structure, as well as your paid staff, to what extent does that reflect the diversity of either the congregation that you currently are or aspire to be? Are there members of these different groups that I've just highlighted? And again, this becomes complicated because there are different theological views and variations both within and across congregations within a denomination, but that matters. How do we structure things? I think about this. I chair our local church board here. And so our local church board, thankfully, has immense diversity when it comes to race and ethnicity and age, and gender, social class, and so forth. But then I think about how do we structure our actual board meetings? It's very linear, Western, white, Eurocentric approaches to how we think about time, to how we think about formality of motions and all these kinds of things. And it doesn't mean those aren't helpful, but it has definitely got us to think about what does this look like for those who don't come from a Western context per se, who think about structure and organizational life differently. And I think not just asking the question, but creating space for different voices within that. Who actually holds the seat of power?
Yeah.
How are other voices invited into that, with the acknowledgement that there are many gifts to be had, and that does involve change. And this goes right up to the denominational level, right? How are denominations structured? Yeah, absolutely. How do we think about the relationship between, say, a new immigrant church plant, for example, that might actually function at a structural level quite differently than we might have thought about church plants even 10, 15, 20 years ago? How do we think about resource allocation? How do we think about the kinds of reporting structures? Even that whole framework of reporting structure reveals a particular way. So those things, if congregations and denominations are going to take seriously the presence of diversity, actually needs to reflect those things in the very structures that frame the organization from a denominational level and a church level. And it starts with those who are holding the keys.
Yeah.
Who is holding the keys, and to what extent are they willing to loosen the grip of those keys so that others can actually have a meaningful and genuine and authentic seat at the table to contribute to those evolving congregations and conversations?
There's a lot of things we have to look at that we assume is normative.
Yes.
That we need to do some work actually around listening to people and understanding there are different ways. There's a question from Cynthia. She said, for 24% of people who no longer belong to a faith group, how do you approach them about returning to church or faith after being so depressed during the pandemic?
Yes. I would say a few things, and maybe this helps to clarify some of the starting assumptions. First, we can't assume that those who say they have no religion ever went to church before. So some of them may have, many may have not. There are different reasons for why they may or may not be connected, and so we unpack those things in that book, None of the Above. I think actually taking a listening posture, just engaging in relationship, this will come back to the neighborhood conversation, just getting to know people. That my primary intention is not to ultimately get you to the church or get you to see the world the same way that I do, but just engage in conversation and listen and learn. I think that's the general disposition and posture. I think when we listen and learn to others, we'll begin to understand if they have or haven't had experiences with the church, what those experiences have been like, ways in which perhaps their bad experiences, if that was the case, may not actually align with a holistic sense of the gospel message. That is a hopeful
Yes.
one, it's a life-giving one. So those things take time to actually dispel those things. The other thing I would say is that not everyone, or even most, whether it's religious nuns or even people in general, are actually coming out of the pandemic depressed, either about the church or about life overall. This is a popular, I would say, myth that has been reinforced in and through the media and churches and schools, etc. That yes, some have understandably struggled, and we shouldn't dismiss that. This has been a hard time for some. But in terms of extraordinary struggles, this isn't necessarily the norm for most people. We know sociologically that those who have social networks and are tied to social networks, congregations being one example, can be an incredible buffer against the challenges of social life. It's an antidote against things like the pandemic, which again doesn't diminish the challenges, but perhaps are not as kind of skyrocketing off the charts as we might assume. And so even our disposition into entering conversation with others, we shouldn't necessarily assume that sort of levels of depression or concern about that are at an all-time high or low. It might be, but sort of come in on neutral ground and territory, and then we'll discover that different people have had different experiences. Yeah, those would be some of my thoughts. In
Thank you. I just received a comment earlier about how in Chinese churches, when they're conservative in terms of how they celebrate successes. And so even just people getting baptized, new people. And so there's kind of, they prioritize evangelism and participate, but there's this kind of, they don't want to be showy about things. That's part of our culture, part of the Chinese church culture. And so that was kind of challenging some of the aspects of normative Western culture. I'd like to kind of just give you just a bit of time to what is your heart for the church? And then just wanted to ask you, Joel, if that's okay. And I know you're doing all this great work on surveying churches, understanding the dynamics, and getting some real data to us. I'm really grateful for that. But if just anything that you would like to share before we close.
Yeah, sure. I just want to comment on the Chinese church context and
Yes.
how that you observed that. I think it's really important. This is a helpful reminder that every congregation has its own distinct context and socio-demographic realities that are in play there. And so I think it's important to embrace the cultural dynamics that are present there. It doesn't mean that one needs to change that that is actually perhaps part of the DNA, and that's part of what helps that particular congregation or set of congregations to tick. And that's fine. It's good for groups to be aware of that in a variety of different cultural spaces. So my hope for the church, my longing for the church is that churches would be a place of joyful hope and optimism in the risen Christ, and that our liturgies, that our messages, that our activities would reflect that we are offering a word of hope and a life of hope to those within our congregation and those out with our congregation. And this maybe connects to my second greatest hope. It is that congregations would have a powerful impact in their neighborhoods and communities, and that we wouldn't be a building centric or Sunday morning centric community of faith. These are both important. They need to be utilized in valuable ways to bring the good news of Christ to the world at large. But they are not the center or end all and be all. So what does it look like to be involved in our communities and neighborhoods, and to look out, not just as a church, but also individuals and family units within one's congregation, to pay attention to those things and to take active steps, and not in a showy, flashy, kind of arrogant way, but we just want to come and partner and be positive impact and influence within our neighborhoods and communities. I would love to see churches who are doing those things. And then third and finally, and this is kind of my my sociological bent or basis, but it connects with a theological orientation as well. It is that churches would take data seriously, that data isn't something to be afraid of, that social scientific work isn't something that we need to kind of say, well, that's fine. We heard a bunch of numbers and we put that over there, but really we're here because of what we read in the Bible, and the Bible is the end all and be all and theologically moving forward. I think data can be a powerful orienting guide to help us understand and exegete our cultural context so that we can minister well. And
Yes.
so my hope, part of what gives me life and what I do as a sociologist of religion and speaking with churches, is that the data would help give some helpful entrance points on a variety of topics that churches are interested in, so that theologically and practically and biblically we can live into the things that we believe God has called us to do, so that we're not just kind of randomly doing a series of things that we think will work, but we have lots of good data, may or may not work for a variety of reasons, but to actually leverage that data in ways that would help us in the things we believe God is calling us to do. So these are some of the hopes I have for local churches and the church overall in Canada.
Thank you. That's a beautiful calling, a vocation that you have to share with so many. So thank you. Bless you. Thanks everyone back home for participating in this learning session. Just want to remind you that all of the learning sessions are recorded, and later on there will be a recognition service at 11:30, and you can get that on baptist.ca/assembly. That will also be recorded. You can view it later. I'd like to thank again Dr. Joel Thiessen and his gift to share his life, his work with us, and we are blessed for it. So bless you all, and thank you for participating in this learning session. Take care.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone. Great to be with you today.
Thank you.